The Fox DHX2 has probably won more races than any other piece of suspension ever. So when a brand doesn't change something frequently, that usually means they got it right. So in this video, I'll tell you how it rides from a mediocre standpoint, and we'll dive into the internal nerdy stuff before I go take it for a ride. So I had to do a full service on this, and I completely stripped it down, like pulled the piggybacks off, so I could basically see what was going on inside of it and try to explain to you in a dumb mechanic standpoint. So no engineer talk, basically this is what you got. A pretty sophisticated compression assembly, like behind the high and low speed compression adjuster. We have an extremely stiff spring, a shim stack, and from my experience, this is one of the better adjusters. Like, it really does a good job at fine-tuning your high and low speed compression. So comment more if you're above me as far as knowledge on this high speed and low speed compression adjuster. So here's the main piston of the DHX2, and it's super sophisticated because basically we can move the shim stacks and the oil flow around from the high speed rebound adjuster. Independently adjusting the high speed rebound on the Fox X2 and the DHX2 doesn't really do that much, but if you move it in conjunction with the compression adjuster, it does a massive tuning range. And it is definitely one of the most impressive pieces of engineering because it basically moves the shim stacks around on the main piston. Tucked up underneath the piggyback, we have another compression base plate oil control valve. So when you move the climb lever, basically these little ports open and close. So effectively the DHX2 has three forms of compression control because it's not a climb lever, it's just a firm lever. And I couldn't find anything that said you can't ride on it, and I ride on it all the time. This is how a shock works. It is extremely simple. So we have the main piston that compresses oil, and then it rebounds oil. Compress oil, rebound oil. Compress oil, rebound oil. The main reason shocks becomes more expensive is because these oil control valves become more finely machined. So this is a twin tube shock, and whenever you see the word twin tube, it's basically just another tube inside of the main piston, and the smart engineer guys can basically flow oil around it and backwards to make a more sophisticated oil control valve. This service job is fairly easy and readily available, and any bike shop can take care of this for you. While everything is a compromise in life, and the DHX2 is one of the most sophisticated pieces of externally adjustable suspension on the market, Fox had to compromise the external structure of the shock in order to get all these adjustments. So because of that compromised external structure of the shock, it tends to be the most infamous shock on the internet as far as braking. So we all have to thank Darren from Push here for educating me and bringing this to you. So the eyelet on the DHX2, because of its high speed rebound adjuster built in, is heavily compromised. And there's only a couple little threads holding the eyelet on the shock, and that's the true weakness of this shock. It's not the thin stanchion. Here's another perspective from Bryce at DVO. Depending on the thread pitch and how many threads are on the eyelet will dictate how strong the stanchion is. All these are correct in some way or another. So we have a 10mm stanchion, so we have a 10 by 1.0 thread. That is a pretty small machine thread holding the eyelet on the DHX2. To further reinforce why coil shocks break, I think I cover this in every video. The Olin shock has a 10mm stanchion, and it is one of the strongest shocks on the market. And then we look at the EXT, and it has a heavily reinforced eyelet instead of a hole carved out of it for a high-speed rebound adjuster. Now the DHX2 has won more races than any other shock on the market, so you can just blame Specialized or the bike brand for making bad designs. That's completely up to you. Moving on to the $10,000 dyno, the DHX2 is extremely impressive at about 34 pounds of pressure all the way through the stroke. To put this in perspective, the RockShox Vivid basically breaks the scale when you get to 50% of the stroke. So the DHX2 is going to be a very linear coil shock on the trail. The DHX2 is a pretty coil shock, meaning you need to rely on the bike's progressivity to make sure you can ride this. It's a DH oriented shock. Rocky Mountain, perfect match. If you are on a more linear suspension type, you may run into problems or need to run a super heavy duty progressive spring, and any progressive spring will fit on this shock because Fox uses very narrow coil springs, so you can add in MRP DVO, or Cane Creek springs to the DHX2 if you do want to ride this on your more linear trail bike. Getting into the clicks on the DHX2, same clicks as the Fox X2. Highly adjustable shock. With 30 pounds of damper activation pressure, let's do the small bump sensitivity check. Truly impressive small bump sensitivity out of the DHX2 because it is a very linear coil shock. So it does have some top out on a fully fast rebound. Moving it to the slowest setting, there's no top out, but the shock is completely dead. And I'll let you know at the end of the video how the DHX2 holds up to EXT Öhlins. The DHX2 on the proper bike is pretty incredible. The Rocky Mountain altitude is extremely progressive in the rear end. Even the lightest progressive setting at 37% is super friendly to the DHX2. I would highly consider you look into your bike and make sure it's progressive before bolting up a DHX2. So let me put this plain and simple. You get out of the DHX2 exactly what you put into it. So for the first couple weeks, I was riding the DHX2 in the recommended setting and barely putting any effort into it, and it was a pretty mediocre shock. Right away, I knew a faster rebound on this shock was making it feel better, but being a lazy mountain biker like most of us are, we don't want to put in a tuning session. So with mediocre performance out of the box from the DHX2, I knew what I needed to do. Heading out to the test track, doing a complete in-depth setup video on the DHX2, the performance back out of the shock was day and night. After the tuning session, heading into the high country to see how she would perform with a much better setup.
Okay, that's climb switch firm, no pedal bob.
With the newly found setup in the DHX2 hucking into the rock gardens, purely impressive traction and confidence. So I basically just set up the stupidest, fastest rebound possible because I want my bike to be kind of poppy and lively and do jibbing fun stuff on the trail because I don't race. The DHX2 is so adjustable you can achieve this, while maintaining a high level of traction and confidence in the chunky trails. My trailside footage is pretty weak and I'll be working on this, but my riding's also weak as well, but just consider Jordy is a pretty average rider and sets up race-winning bikes. So it's not all about skill when it comes to suspension setup. All things considered, the Fox DHX2 at $679 at jensenusa.com is a pretty good value. Now, it is an internal floating piston design shock, and those typically have a slower response rate than a bladder style that's inside the Öhlins and the EXT. So the DHX2 is pretty special because we have such a massive range in rebound, you can tune in the EXT and Öhlins feel with the right setup. So what's most important right now is you click this video on your screen to learn how to set up the DHX2 like I did.